You wake up tomorrow morning, but something's wrong. You're not in your comfortable bed. You're holding a battle axe, wearing animal fur, and a bearded man is shouting at you in Old Norse. Congratulations. You've just been dropped into the life of a Viking warrior. But don't get excited about the adventure, because this is going to be the worst day of your very short life. Hey everyone. Tonight we begin with a journey through time to explore the brutal reality of ancient warriors. From the frozen fjords of Scandinavia to the blood-soaked arenas of Rome, and finally to the suffocating armor of medieval Europe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The morning air cuts through your lungs like ice-cold daggers as you stumble out of the longhouse. The year is 892 AD, and you're somewhere along the Norwegian coast. The sun hasn't risen yet, but that doesn't matter, because during winter it barely shows its face anyway. You're already exhausted, and the day hasn't even begun. Your name, for the next few hours of this nightmare, is Björn. You're 17 years old, which, in Viking terms, makes you practically middle-aged. Life expectancy here hovers around the 25 if you're incredibly lucky, and most warriors don't see their 20th birthday. The battle axe in your hands weighs about 4 pounds, but after carrying it for months, it feels like it's made of lead. The bearded man still shouting at you is Ragnar, your Jarl's lieutenant. He's missing 3 fingers from his left hand, courtesy of a Saxon sword last spring, and his breath smells like fermented fish and rotting teeth. This is normal. Dental hygiene among Vikings was about as sophisticated as their table manners, which is to say, non-existent. "Move, you worthless son of a thrall," Ragnar bellows, spraying you with saliva that freezes before it hits your face. The ships won't load themselves, and if we're not ready to sail by first light, I'll use your spine as kindling. Welcome to Viking motivation. No gentle encouragement here, just threats of creative violence and constant reminders that your life has exactly the same value as a piece of driftwood. You trudge toward the harbor, your feet squelching through a mixture of mud, ice, and things you'd rather not identify. The smell hits you first, a combination of unwashed bodies, rotting fish, tar, and human waste. Vikings didn't believe in waste management. When nature called, you answered wherever you happened to be standing, and if someone complained, well, that was their problem. The long ship before you is both magnificent and terrifying, 30 meters of oak and iron, carved with intricate designs that tell stories of previous raids. The dragon head on the prow stares ahead with painted eyes, and if you look closely, you can see dark stains on the deck that definitely aren't from spilled mead. Other warriors are already loading supplies, and you quickly realize that supplies is a very generous term. There are weapons, of course, swords, axes, spears, and shields. There are also barrels of what Vikings optimistically call food. Dried fish that's harder than shoe leather, fermented grain that tastes like liquid misery, and something that might once have been meat but now looks suspiciously like leather scraps. The clothing situation is equally depressing. You're wearing layers of wool and fur which sounds warm until you realize that Viking wool is roughly as soft as steel wool, and the fur comes from animals that were probably diseased before they died. The whole ensemble is held together with leather straps, hope, and the constant fear that if anything tears, you'll freeze to death before you can fix it. But here's where things get really interesting. Vikings didn't just raid randomly. They had to plan these expeditions months in advance, which meant storing food, organizing crews, and preparing for journeys that could last anywhere from weeks to months. And during those months, you'd be living on a 30-meter boat with 40 other unwashed, violent men who hadn't seen fresh water in weeks. The sleeping arrangements on a longship were exactly as comfortable as you'd expect. There were no beds, no pillows, no privacy. Warriors slept on the deck, packed together like sardines, sharing body heat and constantly fighting over the few animal skins available for warmth. If you were lucky, you might find a spot near the middle of the ship where the rocking was less violent. If you were unlucky, you'd spend the entire voyage vomiting over the side while your fellow warriors mocked your weakness. Food on these expeditions was a constant source of misery. The dried fish was so tough that Vikings had to soak it in seawater before they could even attempt to chew it. The fermented grain was alcoholic enough to kill intestinal parasites, which was good because the Vikings had plenty of those. Fresh water was strictly rationed, which meant most warriors spent their days in a state of mild dehydration, made worse by the constant consumption of what they generously called ale. But the worst part wasn't the physical discomfort. It was the psychological pressure. Viking society was built on reputation, and reputation was earned through violence. If you showed weakness, cowardice, or even hesitation in battle, you weren't just risking your life, you were risking your entire social standing. A Viking who couldn't fight was worse than dead. He was forgotten. The raids themselves were exercises in organized chaos. Vikings didn't just storm onto beaches swinging axes randomly. They were actually quite sophisticated in their tactics, using surprise, speed, and overwhelming violence to achieve their goals. But being sophisticated didn't make the experience any less terrifying for the warriors involved. Picture this. You're crammed into a longship with 40 other men, sailing through rough seas toward a foreign coast. You haven't slept properly in days. You're living on dried fish and questionable water, and you know that in a few hours you'll be running toward armed enemies while screaming at the top of your lungs. The adrenaline is already pumping through your system, but it's not the good kind of excitement you get from modern extreme sports. This is the raw, animalistic fear that comes from knowing you might die horribly in the next few hours. When the ship finally reached the target, usually a monastery, trading post, or small village, the Vikings had to move fast. Speed was everything. The longer they stayed in one place, the more likely it was that local defenders would organize and fight back. So the raid became a frantic race. Get ashore, grab everything valuable, kill anyone who resisted, and get back to the ships before reinforcements arrived. Your job as a warrior was simple in theory, but nightmarish in practice. You had to run toward armed enemies while carrying weapons that weighed more than modern soldiers' entire kit. Your shield was made of wood and leather, which provided some protection but would splinter under a direct hit from a sword or axe. Your armor, if you had any, was usually just a leather vest with metal studs. The wealthy warriors might have chainmail, but that was heavy, expensive, and still wouldn't stop a well-placed spear thrust. The actual fighting was nothing like the choreographed battles you see in movies. It was chaotic, brutal, and over quickly. Warriors swung their weapons wildly, hoping to connect with something vital while trying not to trip over bodies or slip in the blood that quickly covered the ground. The noise was overwhelming, screaming, metal clashing against metal, and the wet sounds of weapons finding their marks. And if you survived the initial assault, congratulations. Now you got to spend the next several hours looting, which meant carrying heavy chests, bags of grain, and whatever else the Vikings considered valuable back to the ships. This had to be done quickly, while constantly watching for counterattacks, and often while wounded warriors bled all over the plunder. But here's the thing that really separated Viking warriors from modern soldiers. There was no medical support. If you got wounded during a raid, your treatment options were basically pour some mead on it and hope for the best. Vikings did have some knowledge of herbal medicine, but their understanding of anatomy was roughly equivalent to a modern third grader's. Serious wounds meant death, usually slow and agonizing. The journey home was often worse than the raid itself. Ships loaded with plunder sat lower in the water, making them slower and less maneuverable. Wounded warriors who couldn't row were dead weight, consuming precious food and water while contributing nothing to the ship's progress. And if the weather turned bad, which it often did in the North Sea, the heavily loaded ships could easily sink, taking their crews and treasure to the bottom. Even if you made it home alive, your problems weren't over. Viking society expected warriors to be generous with their plunder, sharing wealth with their crew, their jarl, and their families. A successful raid might leave you with enough silver to live comfortably for a few months, but winter was always coming, and winter meant planning the next raid. The social pressure never ended. Vikings who didn't raid regularly were seen as weak, cowardly, or lazy. But Vikings who raided too often had a tendency to die young, leaving their families with nothing. It was a no-win situation that trapped young men in cycles of violence they couldn't escape. And then, there was the religious aspect. Vikings believed that warriors who died in battle would be taken to Valhalla, where they'd feast with the gods and fight eternal battles. This sounds exciting until you realize that it meant the best thing that could happen to a Viking warrior was to die violently. The culture literally celebrated death in combat as the highest achievement possible. But what about the warriors who didn't die gloriously in battle? What about the ones who survived long enough to grow old? Viking society had very little use for aging warriors. Once you lost your strength, speed, or courage, you became a burden. Old Vikings often ended up as storytellers or advisors, but these were positions of respect rather than power. The real authority always belonged to the young, strong warriors who could still swing an axe effectively. The daily life of a Viking warrior, when not raiding, was equally miserable. Vikings lived in longhouses, large rectangular buildings that housed entire extended families. These weren't cozy family homes. They were more like communal barracks where privacy was impossible and personal space was measured in inches. The longhouse was typically about 30 meters long and 6 meters wide, with a central fire pit that provided heat and light. There were no windows, so the only illumination came from the fire and whatever sunlight leaked through the smoke hole in the roof. During winter, when the fire burned constantly, the air inside was thick with smoke that stung your eyes and made breathing difficult. Sleeping arrangements in the longhouse were based on social hierarchy. The Jarl and his family got the area closest to the fire, while lower-ranking warriors and their families were relegated to the colder areas near the walls. Everyone slept on wooden platforms covered with whatever animal skins they could afford. The platforms were hard. The skins were often crawling with lice and fleas, and the constant smoke made everything smell like a campfire. Food preparation was a communal activity, which meant you ate whatever the group was eating, whether you liked it or not. The Vikings' diet consisted mainly of fish, grain, and whatever meat they could get from their livestock. Fresh vegetables were rare, especially in winter, and scurvy was a constant threat. The Vikings did eat some dairy products, but their milk and cheese were often sour or spoiled, adding another layer of misery to mealtime. Personal hygiene among Vikings was practically non-existent. They bathed infrequently, usually only when the smell became so overwhelming that even other Vikings complained. Their clothes were rarely washed, and when they were, the process involved beating them with sticks in cold water, which did little to remove embedded dirt and odor. Dental care consisted of chewing on twigs or pieces of bone to try to scrape the worst buildup off their teeth. Most Vikings lost several teeth by age 30, and tooth pain was a constant companion. There were no dentists, no painkillers, and no real understanding of dental hygiene. Warriors just endured the pain until their teeth either fell out or killed them through infection. Disease was another constant threat. Vikings had no understanding of germs or contagion, so illnesses spread rapidly through the crowded longhouses. Common ailments included dysentery, pneumonia, and various skin infections. The Vikings' medical knowledge was limited to a few herbal remedies, and the belief that most illnesses were caused by angry spirits or curses. Wounds from fighting were treated with whatever materials were available. Vikings would clean wounds with ale or mead, then bandage them with strips of cloth or leather. If a wound became infected, which happened frequently, the warrior usually died slowly and painfully. Amputation was sometimes attempted, but without anesthesia or proper surgical tools, it was often just a quicker way to die. The psychological toll of constant violence and uncertainty was enormous. Vikings lived with the knowledge that death could come at any moment from enemy weapons, disease, accidents, or even fellow Vikings. Trust was a luxury that few could afford, and paranoia was often a survival skill. Women in Viking society faced their own unique hardships. While Viking women had more rights than women in many other cultures of the time, they were still expected to manage households, bear children, and cope with the constant absence of their men during raiding seasons. Many Viking women became widows at young ages, left to raise children and manage property while hoping their husbands' comrades would honor their obligations to help the families of fallen warriors. The children of Vikings grew up in this environment of violence and uncertainty. Boys were expected to begin training as warriors as soon as they could hold a weapon, usually around age 10 or 12. This training consisted mainly of mock combat with older boys and men, often resulting in serious injuries. Girls were trained to manage households and support their future warrior husbands. Education, as we understand it, didn't exist for most Vikings. Literacy was extremely rare, limited mainly to runic inscriptions used for magic or marking ownership. Most Vikings couldn't read or write, relying instead on oral traditions to pass down their history and culture. This meant that individual Vikings had very limited access to information beyond what they could personally observe or hear from others. The economic system that supported Viking warriors was based almost entirely on raiding and trading, both of which were dangerous and unreliable. A successful raid could provide enough wealth to support a warrior and his family for months, but raids could also result in death, injury, or complete failure. There was no social safety net, no insurance, and no guaranteed income. Warriors who couldn't raid due to injury or age often faced poverty and starvation. As winter deepened and the raiding season ended, Vikings faced the annual challenge of surviving until spring. Food stores had to last through months of cold weather, and there was no way to preserve fresh food effectively. Vikings ate a lot of dried and salted fish, fermented grain, and whatever meat they could keep from spoiling. Vitamin deficiencies were common, leading to diseases like scurvy and rickets. The darkness of Scandinavian winters affected Vikings psychologically as well as physically. With only a few hours of dim sunlight each day, depression and seasonal affective disorder were common, though Vikings had no names for these conditions. They simply endured the long dark months as best they could, telling stories around the fire and planning for the next raiding season. As our hypothetical day as a Viking warrior draws to a close, you've experienced just a tiny sample of what this life entailed. You felt the cold that never really goes away, smelled the odors that permeate everything, and experienced the constant threat of violence that shaped every decision. And this was just one day. Imagine living this way for years, watching friends die in raids, suffering through harsh winters, and knowing that your own death was probably just around the corner. The Viking warrior's life was one of constant hardship, violence, and uncertainty. They lived in a world where strength was the only currency that mattered, where showing weakness meant death, and where even the strongest warriors rarely lived to see old age. It was a life that produced legendary fighters and memorable stories, but it was also a life that most modern people would find absolutely unbearable. Now, let's fast forward a few centuries and move south to the heart of the Roman Empire. Congratulations! You've just traded your Viking axe for a gladius, and your frozen fjord for the burning sands of the Colosseum. If you thought being a Viking was bad, welcome to the life of a Roman gladiator, where every day might literally be your last, and your death exists solely for the entertainment of people who see you as less than human. The sun is already blazing overhead as you're shoved into the holding area beneath the Colosseum. The year is 150 AD, and you're now Marcus, a 22-year-old who was once a free citizen until debt forced you to sell yourself into gladiatorial service. That's right, not all gladiators were slaves or prisoners of war. Many were free men who were so desperate for money that they voluntarily entered into what was essentially a death contract. The smell down here is indescribable. Imagine a mixture of unwashed bodies, blood, urine, animal waste, and rotting meat, all fermenting together in the Mediterranean heat. There's no ventilation to speak of, just a few small openings that let in barely enough light to see the rats scurrying between the cells. These aren't small, cute rats either. They're massive creatures that have grown fat feeding on the remains of gladiators who didn't survive their fights. Your cell is roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, with stone walls that weep moisture and a floor covered in moldy straw. You share this luxurious accommodation with 3 other gladiators: a Gaul who barely speaks Latin, a German who hasn't said a word since he arrived 6 months ago, and a former legionnaire who was dishonorably discharged for cowardice and chose the arena over execution. The guards are a special breed of human cruelty. They're typically former gladiators who survived long enough to earn their freedom, or soldiers who were too brutal even for the Roman army. They carry whips, clubs, and keys, and they use all 3 liberally. Discipline in gladiator schools wasn't about building character or teaching lessons. It was about breaking spirits and ensuring absolute obedience. Your daily routine begins before dawn with the sound of whips cracking and guards shouting. There's no gentle wake-up call, no breakfast in bed. You're dragged from your cell and marched to the training area, where you'll spend the next 8 to 10 hours learning new and creative ways to kill other human beings. The training itself is overseen by a man called the lanista, essentially a combination of drill sergeant, business manager, and slave driver. The lanista owns the gladiator school and has a vested interest in keeping his fighters alive long enough to turn a profit, but he's not particularly concerned about their comfort or happiness. His job is to turn terrified, often unwilling men into efficient killing machines, and he's very good at it. Gladiator training was nothing like the noble martial arts you see in movies. It was brutal, repetitive, and designed to overcome natural human reluctance to kill. You practice the same basic moves thousands of times until they became automatic reflexes. Thrust, parry, block, strike, over and over until your muscles remembered the movements even when your mind was paralyzed with fear. The weapons varied depending on what type of gladiator you were trained to be. The retiarius fought with a net and trident, making him fast but lightly armored. The Murmillo carried a heavy shield and short sword, trading mobility for protection. The Thraex used a curved sword and small shield, requiring skill and speed to be effective. Each style had its advantages and disadvantages, but they all had one thing in common. They were designed to create entertaining fights, not to give gladiators the best chance of survival. The armor, such as it was, prioritized spectacle over protection. A gladiator's equipment was expensive and ornate, but it often left vital areas deliberately exposed to ensure that fights wouldn't drag on too long. Crowds wanted to see blood, and lots of it. So gladiator armor was designed to allow for dramatic, visible wounds that would satisfy the audience's bloodlust. Food in the gladiator school was barely adequate to keep fighters alive and strong enough to put on a good show. The basic diet consisted of barley, beans, and occasionally some meat, usually the cheapest cuts available. Gladiators were fed regularly, but the food was bland, monotonous, and calculated to provide just enough nutrition to maintain muscle mass without wasting money on unnecessary luxuries like flavor or variety. Water was strictly controlled. Gladiators received a daily ration that was sufficient for survival but not comfort. During hot weather or intensive training, this led to constant dehydration, which in turn caused headaches, fatigue, and difficulty concentrating. But concentration was crucial in the arena, where a moment's lapse could mean death. Medical care for gladiators was more advanced than what Vikings received, but it was still primitive by modern standards. Roman physicians had some understanding of anatomy and wound treatment, but they lacked antibiotics, anesthesia, and many other medical advances we take for granted. Gladiators who were wounded in training or combat received basic treatment, cleaning wounds, setting broken bones, and hoping for the best. The psychological preparation for arena combat was perhaps the most brutal aspect of gladiator training. Instructors used various techniques to overcome fighters' natural reluctance to kill. Some schools forced new gladiators to watch executions and public torture to desensitize them to violence. Others used psychological manipulation, convincing fighters that their opponents were subhuman and deserved to die. The night before a gladiator's first fight was traditionally spent in prayer and preparation. Many gladiators wrote letters to their families, made offerings to the gods, or simply tried to come to terms with the likelihood that they wouldn't survive the next day. Suicide was not uncommon during these final hours, though it was difficult to accomplish given the constant supervision. The morning of a fight began with a ritual meal, possibly the gladiator's last. This wasn't a feast, just a simple breakfast designed to provide energy without causing digestive problems during combat. Many gladiators couldn't eat at all due to nerves, while others gorged themselves, figuring it might be their final opportunity. The parade into the arena was both magnificent and terrifying. Gladiators marched through underground tunnels and then emerged into the blazing sunlight to face crowds of up to 50,000 screaming spectators. The noise was overwhelming, not just cheering, but actual bloodthirsty roaring as the crowd anticipated the violence to come. The famous gladiator salute, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail, Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. May be mostly a Hollywood invention, but the sentiment was real. Gladiators understood that they were walking into an arena where death was not just possible, but expected and celebrated. The fights themselves varied widely in format and style. Some were one-on-one duels between skilled fighters, while others were mass battles involving dozens of participants. Some fights were to the death, while others ended when one fighter was clearly defeated but could still be saved if the crowd was feeling merciful. Combat in the arena was nothing like sword fighting in movies. It was desperate, exhausting, and usually quite brief. Gladiators were trained to put on a show, but when facing death, their priority was survival, not entertainment. This often led to cautious, defensive fighting that frustrated crowds expecting constant action and blood. The sand on the arena floor wasn't there for traction, it was there to absorb blood and other bodily fluids. Fresh sand was raked over the arena between fights, creating a clean surface for the next bout while burying the evidence of what had just occurred. Underneath that fresh sand lay the remains of countless previous fights. Crowd reaction played a huge role in determining a gladiator's fate. A fighter who put on an exciting show might be spared even if he lost, while one who fought boringly could be condemned to death even if he won. The emperor or presiding official made the final decision, but they were heavily influenced by the crowd's wishes. In a very real sense, gladiators were performing for their lives. The aftermath of combat was often as brutal as the fighting itself. Wounded gladiators were dragged from the arena and either treated or left to die, depending on their value and the severity of their injuries. Those who died had their bodies stripped of valuable equipment and then disposed of in mass graves outside the city. There were no individual burials, no monuments, no mourning periods, just efficient disposal of human remains. Gladiators who survived their fights faced a different kind of torture, the knowledge that they would have to do it all again. Successful gladiators could earn money, fans, and even some degree of fame, but they were still slaves or indentured servants who couldn't leave when they wanted to. Freedom came only through years of survival and victory, and most gladiators died long before earning their release. The few gladiators who did survive long enough to earn their freedom faced a difficult transition back to civilian life. They were marked men, literally. Gladiators were often branded or tattooed to identify their status. Free society looked down on them as brutal killers who had sold their humanity for entertainment. Many former gladiators ended up working in the gladiator schools as trainers or guards, unable to find any other employment. The social status of gladiators was complex and contradictory. They were simultaneously despised and celebrated, seen as both heroes and criminals. Women sometimes became infatuated with successful gladiators, but these relationships were scandalous and rarely led to marriage or acceptance in respectable society. The gladiator system was supported by a massive infrastructure of breeding, training, and transportation. Schools throughout the empire produced fighters for local games, while the best gladiators were transported to Rome for the major spectacles. This required significant investment in facilities, equipment, and personnel, making gladiatorial combat a major industry in the Roman economy. The psychological impact of gladiatorial combat extended beyond the fighters themselves to the spectators who watched and cheered for death. Regular exposure to extreme violence desensitized Roman society to brutality and suffering, contributing to a culture that accepted and even celebrated cruelty as entertainment. Religious and philosophical objections to gladiatorial combat did exist, but they were overwhelmed by popular enthusiasm for the games. Some early Christians refused to attend gladiatorial spectacles, viewing them as barbaric and immoral, but they were a small minority in a society that saw arena combat as a normal and acceptable form of entertainment. The economics of gladiatorial combat were brutal and calculating. Gladiators were investments, and their owners wanted to maximize their return before the inevitable loss. This led to careful matchmaking designed to create exciting contests while protecting valuable fighters, at least until they could generate sufficient profit to justify their replacement. As the Roman Empire declined, gladiatorial combat gradually fell out of favor, but not due to moral objections. Economic pressures, administrative difficulties, and changing entertainment preferences eventually made the games too expensive and complicated to maintain. The last recorded gladiatorial contest took place in 435 AD, ending nearly 7 centuries of institutionalized human blood sport. Your day as a Roman gladiator ends not with victory or defeat, but with the simple fact of survival. You've lived through another 24 hours in a system designed to kill you for the amusement of others. Tomorrow, you'll wake up in the same cell, eat the same food, and face the same possibility that you'll die for someone else's entertainment. It's a life that makes even Viking warfare look appealing by comparison. Finally, we leap forward several more centuries to medieval Europe, where you're about to discover that being a knight, supposedly the pinnacle of medieval warrior society, was actually its own special brand of nightmare. Welcome to the life of Sir Geoffrey, a minor nobleman who has just discovered that chivalry, honor, and glory come with a price tag that includes constant discomfort, financial ruin, and a very real possibility of dying in the most undignified ways imaginable. The year is 1347, and you're standing in your castle courtyard at dawn, looking at the pile of metal that you're about to strap onto your body. This is your armor, and it weighs approximately 60 pounds, roughly equivalent to carrying a medium-sized dog on your back all day, except this dog is made of steel and is designed to distribute its weight in the most uncomfortable way possible. Getting into armor isn't something you can do alone. It requires at least one squire, preferably two, and about 30 minutes of careful work to ensure everything is properly fastened and positioned. First comes the padded undergarment called an accaton, which is supposed to prevent the armor from chafing your skin raw. It doesn't work very well, but it's better than nothing. Next comes the chain mail, if you're wealthy enough to afford it. Chain mail is essentially thousands of tiny metal rings linked together into a flexible mesh. It provides decent protection against slashing attacks, but it's heavy, expensive, and has a tendency to catch on everything you try to walk past. It also doesn't breathe at all, so wearing it in warm weather is like being slowly cooked in a metal oven. Over the chain mail goes the plate armor, the iconic knight's outfit that everyone recognizes from movies and paintings. Plate armor was actually quite advanced for its time, offering excellent protection against most medieval weapons. The problem was that it turned its wearer into a barely mobile fortress who could hardly see, hear, or breathe properly. The helmet is particularly problematic. Medieval helmets were designed to protect the head from sword blows, arrow strikes, and other battlefield hazards, but they weren't designed with comfort or visibility in mind. Most helmets severely restricted vision, often limiting the wearer to a narrow slit that provided tunnel vision at best. Breathing was difficult, communication was nearly impossible, and the constant clanging of metal against metal made it hard to hear anything happening around you. Once you're fully armored, simple tasks become monumental challenges. Walking requires careful attention to balance and foot placement. Running is virtually impossible. Mounting a horse becomes an elaborate process requiring assistance from multiple people, and if you fall down, getting back up without help is often impossible. The physical demands of wearing armor extended far beyond the obvious weight and mobility issues. The constant pressure of metal against your body created pressure sores and raw spots that became infected in an age before antibiotics. The lack of ventilation meant that knights sweated constantly, leading to dehydration, heat exhaustion, and a smell that would clear a room in seconds. Combat while wearing armor was exhausting in ways that are difficult to imagine. Medieval battles often lasted for hours, during which knights were expected to fight continuously while carrying their 60-pound metal burden. The combination of physical exertion, restricted breathing, and constant vigilance against attack left even the strongest knights completely exhausted within minutes of serious combat. But here's something that might surprise you. Most medieval knights weren't actually professional soldiers. They were landowners whose military service was a feudal obligation rather than a career choice. This meant that many knights were essentially weekend warriors who were called up for military service a few times per year but spent most of their time managing farms, and dealing with administrative duties. The economics of knighthood were ruinous for all but the wealthiest families. A complete set of armor cost roughly the equivalent of a small castle, and it required constant maintenance and occasional replacement. Horses suitable for knightly combat were equally expensive, and a knight typically needed several of them since war horses had a tendency to die in battle or suffer career-ending injuries. The code of chivalry that supposedly governed knightly behavior was mostly a literary invention that bore little resemblance to reality. Real medieval knights were often brutal, greedy, and violent men who used their military training and equipment to terrorize peasants and extract wealth from anyone weaker than themselves. The romantic image of chivalrous knights protecting the innocent was largely created by later writers who romanticized a period they had never experienced. Daily life for a knight involved far more mundane activities than glorious combat. Most of a knight's time was spent managing his estate, collecting rents and taxes from peasants, settling disputes, and dealing with the complex web of feudal obligations that governed medieval society. Military action was relatively rare, and when it did occur, it was often brief, brutal, and decidedly unromantic. Training for knighthood began in childhood and was often traumatic. Boys from noble families were sent away from home at age 7 or 8 to serve as pages in other nobles' households. This wasn't summer camp. It was essentially indentured servitude designed to teach obedience, respect for hierarchy, and basic martial skills through harsh discipline and constant supervision. At age 14, successful pages became squires, which meant taking on more responsibility and beginning serious weapons training. Squires learned to handle swords, lances, and other knightly weapons, while also serving as personal assistants to established knights. This included helping with armor, caring for horses, and performing various menial tasks that were considered part of their education. The ceremony of knighthood itself, when it finally came, was less about recognition of skill or virtue than about formal induction into the feudal system. New knights swore oaths of loyalty to their lords and accepted the obligations that came with their new status. These obligations included military service, financial support for their lord's campaigns, and participation in the complex social rituals that maintained medieval hierarchy. Marriage for knights was typically a business arrangement designed to consolidate landholdings, forge political alliances, or settle debts. Love was considered irrelevant, and knights often met their wives for the first time on their wedding day. Many knights maintained long-term relationships with mistresses or prostitutes, but these relationships had no legal status and offered no security for the women involved. The castle life that knights supposedly enjoyed was often cold, damp, and uncomfortable. Medieval castles were built for defense, not comfort, and they were notoriously difficult to heat effectively. Even wealthy knights often lived in conditions that would be considered primitive by modern standards, with limited privacy, poor sanitation, and constant drafts. Food for knights was generally better than what peasants ate, but it was still monotonous and nutritionally inadequate. The medieval diet was heavy on meat and bread, but light on fresh vegetables and fruits, leading to various vitamin deficiencies and health problems. Preservation techniques were primitive. So much of the food was either heavily salted or approaching spoilage by the time it was consumed. Medical care for knights was slightly better than what was available to commoners, but it was still primitive and often dangerous. Medieval physicians had limited understanding of anatomy, disease, or effective treatment methods. Knights wounded in battle were often treated with techniques that were more likely to cause infection than prevent it. The psychological pressures of knighthood were enormous. Knights were expected to display courage in battle, wisdom in council, and justice in their dealings with others, but they received little training in how to handle the stress and trauma that came with their responsibilities. Many knights struggled with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and other mental health issues, but medieval society had no understanding of these conditions and offered no effective treatment. Religious obligations added another layer of complexity to knightly life. Knights were expected to be devout Christians who supported the church both financially and militarily. This meant participating in crusades, which were expensive, dangerous, and often futile military expeditions to the Holy Land. Many knights bankrupted themselves financing crusading expeditions that accomplished little beyond enriching the church and Italian merchants. The Crusades themselves were far from the noble religious endeavors portrayed in Romantic literature. They were brutal, often poorly organized military campaigns that resulted in massive casualties and widespread atrocities. Knights who participated in crusades faced months or years of travel through hostile territory, inadequate supplies, disease, and constant threat of attack by enemies who knew the terrain far better than the invading Europeans. Even successful crusading knights often returned home to find their estates mismanaged, their wealth depleted, and their families struggling to survive. The feudal system that supported knighthood was fragile and required constant attention to maintain. Absentee landlords, even ones absent on holy missions, often found their holdings transferred to more attentive rivals. The decline of knighthood began well before the Renaissance, as changing military technology made heavily armored cavalry increasingly obsolete. The development of effective longbows, crossbows, and early firearms gave common soldiers the ability to kill knights at a distance, negating the advantages of expensive armor and extensive training. The rise of professional armies also reduced the military importance of feudal levies led by knights. Social changes further undermined the knightly class. The growth of trade and commerce created new sources of wealth that didn't depend on land ownership or military service. Merchants and craftsmen began to challenge the political dominance of the traditional nobility, often using their economic power to purchase titles and privileges that had previously been restricted to hereditary knights. The legal system that protected knightly privileges also began to evolve during the later medieval period. The development of royal courts and professional judges reduced the knight's traditional role as local arbiters of justice. Centralized governments increasingly took over functions that had previously been handled by individual knights or small groups of nobles. Technological advances in agriculture and manufacturing reduced the economic importance of the feudal system that supported knighthood. Improved plows, crop rotation techniques, and other innovations allowed fewer people to produce more food, reducing the need for the complex network of obligations and services that characterize feudal society. The cultural ideals that had glorified knighthood also began to change during the later medieval period. The growth of literacy and the spread of new ideas through printed books exposed more people to alternative values and worldviews. The Renaissance emphasis on individual achievement and classical learning often conflicted with the feudal ideals of loyalty and hierarchy that had sustained knighthood. By the time our hypothetical day as a medieval knight ends, you've experienced the reality behind the romantic myth. You've spent hours struggling with heavy, uncomfortable armor, dealt with the complex social and economic obligations of feudal society, and faced the constant possibility of violence, injury, or financial ruin. The life of a knight was one of privilege compared to that of a peasant, but it was also one of enormous responsibility, constant pressure, and frequent disappointment. The armor that was supposed to protect you also isolated you from the world around you, making simple communication difficult and basic human needs like eating, drinking, or relieving yourself into elaborate procedures. The code of chivalry that was supposed to guide your actions often conflicted with the practical necessities of survival in a violent and unpredictable world. The economic system that supported your lifestyle was precarious and required constant attention to maintain. A single bad harvest, military defeat, or political miscalculation could destroy generations of accumulated wealth and status. The feudal obligations that gave you power over others also bound you to a rigid hierarchy that limited your freedom and autonomy. The religious framework that legitimized your authority also imposed its own demands and restrictions. Knights were expected to be warriors for Christ, but this often meant participating in expensive and dangerous military expeditions that served the church's interests more than their own. The tension between Christian ideals of peace and mercy and the violent realities of medieval life created moral dilemmas that many knights were unable to resolve satisfactorily. As our journey through time comes to an end, we've seen that the life of an ancient warrior, whether Viking, gladiator, or knight, was far from the romanticized versions we encounter in movies, books, and popular culture. Each of these warrior classes faced unique challenges, but they all shared certain common experiences: violence, hardship, uncertainty, and early death. The Viking warrior lived in a world where strength and courage were the only currencies that mattered, but where even the strongest and bravest fighters rarely lived to see old age. Their lives were defined by brutal raids, harsh winters, and a social system that celebrated death in battle as the highest achievement possible. The Roman gladiator existed solely for the entertainment of others, fighting and dying in arenas while crowds cheered for blood and spectacle. Their lives were not their own, and their deaths served no purpose beyond providing momentary amusement for people who saw them as less than human. The medieval knight was supposedly the pinnacle of warrior society, protected by armor and elevated by chivalry. But the reality was one of financial pressure, physical discomfort, and social obligations that often conflicted with personal desires and moral principles. What united all these warrior cultures was their acceptance of violence as a normal and necessary part of life. They lived in worlds where might made right, where showing weakness meant death, and where survival required constant vigilance and readiness to kill or be killed. These warriors were products of their times, shaped by societies that valued martial prowess above almost everything else. They weren't necessarily evil or immoral people, but they lived according to rules and values that most modern people would find alien and disturbing. The romanticization of ancient warriors in popular culture does a disservice both to historical accuracy and to our understanding of human progress. These weren't noble heroes fighting for justice and freedom. They were mostly desperate men trying to survive in brutal systems that offered few alternatives to violence. Understanding the reality of ancient warrior life helps us appreciate the relative peace and security that most people enjoy in the modern world. While our societies certainly have their own problems and challenges, very few of us live with the constant threat of violent death that defined the existence of Vikings, gladiators, and knights. The stories of these ancient warriors also remind us of the importance of social institutions, legal systems, and cultural values that promote cooperation over conflict. The societies that produced these warrior classes were ones where violence was the primary means of resolving disputes, accumulating wealth, and achieving status. The development of alternatives to violence, diplomacy, trade, law, education, represents genuine human progress that we should neither take for granted nor romanticize away. As you drift off to sleep tonight, comfortable in your warm bed, protected by laws and institutions that make violence the exception rather than the rule. Remember the warriors whose stories we've shared. They lived and died in worlds far harsher than ours, facing challenges that would break most modern people within days or hours. Their courage was real, even if their causes were often questionable. Their skills were impressive, even if they were primarily devoted to destruction. Their stories are worth remembering, not because we should emulate their examples, but because understanding their struggles helps us appreciate how far human civilization has progressed from those dark and violent times. Sleep well, knowing that you live in an age where being a warrior is a choice rather than a necessity, where violence is the exception rather than the rule, and where the strength of law has largely replaced the law of strength. The ancient warriors whose lives we've explored tonight would probably envy your peaceful slumber more than anything else about your modern existence. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be undisturbed by the ghosts of those who fought and died in ages past, when the world was young and life was cheap, and when being a warrior meant accepting that each day might very well be your last.